Welcome to The Explainer. You know, we hear about special economic zones, or SEZs, in the news literally all the time, and usually they are shrouded in a pretty intense debate. Well, today we are completely setting aside the politics. We're going to look strictly at the source material, the hard data, and the true economic impacts. Let's get right into it. Okay, here is our roadmap for today. We'll cover the SEZ controversy, the evolution of the SEZ, competing economic theories, India's 2005 SEZ Act, the hard data, and finally, restructuring the economy. Section 1, the SEZ controversy. Right off the bat, to really grasp the intense national debate that sparked right after the rush to set up these zones in India, we have to ask a foundational question. Are SEZs purely economic engines driving industrial growth, or are they controversial land grabs? This question sits at the very heart of the whole nationwide debate. It's a seriously high-stakes issue, so let's look at what our source material tells us about how both sides frame their arguments. As you'd expect, there are two very distinct sides here. Supporters highlight the major impacts on investment, exports, and employment. They argue that these zones are absolutely crucial for fostering global value chains and building vital infrastructure. On the flip side, dissenters raise serious concerns about the displacement of farmers and the loss of fertile agricultural land. They also warn against the risk of these zones being misused for real estate, which could potentially lead to a huge revenue loss to the public exchequer. Today, we are looking at these viewpoints completely neutrally, focusing purely on what the academic research tells us about their origins and their real-world impact. Section 2. Evolution of the SEZ. To really understand India's position, we need to zoom out for a second and explore how these zones have developed globally over the centuries. Because actually, SEZs aren't a modern invention at all. The timeline really begins way back in 1547 with trade-based SEZs, specifically free ports in Italy that were meant to facilitate transiting trade. Then, by 1958, we see the very first manufacturing-based export processing zones pop up in Shannon, Ireland. Fast forward to the late 1970s, and China introduces massive, comprehensive SEZs that function literally like standalone cities. And by the 1990s, we start getting newer transnational varieties, like cross-border zones. So the model is constantly evolving. But what's truly staggering is the sheer explosion of these zones globally. According to our sources, in 1975, there were just 79 zones worldwide. By 2006, that number skyrocketed to 3,500 zones spread across 130 countries. That is a massive, worldwide structural shift in how countries approach trade and industry. Section 3. Competing economic theories. So you might be wondering, why do governments even use them? Well, there are two economic theories that offer entirely different lenses on SEZs. The neoclassical, or orthodox approach, basically views them as a second-best temporary fix. They see them as distortionary trade instruments and argue for pure free trade with minimal state intervention across the board. But the heterodox approach tells a very different story. It advocates for a strategic mix of state and market interactions. In this view, domestic firms often lack the know-how or the international channels to compete globally on their own. So SEZs act as a government-sponsored initiative to fill those gaps, attract foreign direct investment, and promote technology spillovers. They're seen as necessary stepping stones. And the crucial point here is perfectly captured by the concept of agglomeration economies. SEZs aren't just about handing out cheap land or tax breaks. No, they are deliberately designed to cluster talent, resources, and outward-oriented firms geographically. By bringing together technology, specialized talent, and competing companies into one single bounded area, you spark intense innovation and knowledge spillovers that simply wouldn't happen if those firms were isolated from each other. It's like a giant puzzle, where all the pieces make each other better just by being close together. Section 4. India's 2005 SEZ Act. Now that we understand the global context and the underlying theories, let's look at India's legislative turning point. The 2005 Act was a monumental paradigm shift. It moved India away from small, centrally run export processing zones and toward massive, comprehensive SEZs. We are talking about a minimum size of 1,000 hectares for multi-product zones so they can act as independent, integrated towns, complete with their own medical and educational facilities. It also introduced a single window mechanism to rapidly cut through red tape. And crucially, its primary thrust was to attract private investment, not just for manufacturing, but to actually fund and build the infrastructure of the zones themselves. Section 5. The hard data. Theories and laws are great, but let's pivot and look directly at the quantifiable results of that 2005 Act. The numbers are staggering. I mean, this is the kind of jump that literally breaks the y-axis on a chart. Between the time the Act was passed in December 2009, investment in newly notified SEZs rocketed by 3,081%, reaching over 1.15 million rupees. That absolutely proves that the policy was highly effective at stimulating additional investments that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. And that explosive investment didn't just sit in a bank account. It translated directly into human jobs. The data shows that 228,226 direct jobs were created in these newly notified zones alone by the end of 2009. And that doesn't even count the massive indirect employment generated by the construction and peripheral services required to build these modern megatownships in the first place. The real-world impact on trade is also crystal clear when we compare the export performance. The data tracking export growth specifically from SEZs massively outpaces domestic tariff area growth, shooting up significantly right around that 2005 to 2008 period after the Act came into full force. But here is perhaps the most incredible data point: the resilience of SEZs during the 2008 global financial crisis. When the world experienced its worst economic shock since the 1930s, national merchandise exports dropped by 28.47%. But SEZ exports, they actually grew by 36.4%. They acted as the sole source of solace for the entire export sector, jumping to $22 billion while the rest of the economy was contracting. Section 6. Restructuring the economy. So we've seen the static statistics, but let's transition to the deeper, dynamic benefits of how SEZs fundamentally restructure society. To understand why this restructuring is even necessary, we really have to look at the agricultural crisis. The land-man ratio has been dropping sharply, leaving only 0.725 hectares per household in 2003. This leads to the stark reality that nearly 48.6% of farmer households were deeply indebted. Agricultural worker productivity is merely 1/5 of non-agricultural sectors. And this isn't just a dry statistic, right? It's a highly relatable human narrative showing exactly why millions of people desperately need non-agricultural jobs just to escape the cycle of poverty and fragmented, unviable land ownership. This is exactly where SEZs step in. They act as the state-driven catalyst to shift labor from low-productivity agriculture into high-tech, skill-intensive industries like pharma, IT, and specialized manufacturing. The ultimate unquantifiable goal here isn't just to boost exports. It's to elevate the entire national workforce, promote horizontal and vertical diversification, and insert the domestic economy into high-value global value chains. The economist Paul Romer actually hit the nail on the head when he said, "Economic growth occurs whenever people take resources and rearrange them in ways that are more valuable." Simply reorganizing where and how people work, grouping them together in these high-efficiency agglomerations, generates explosive, exponential value for an economy. Which brings us to our final thought. How will developing nations balance their world traditions with a relentless march of global value chains? As we've seen today, SEZs offer a powerful, mathematically proven tool for economic transformation, but they also bring intense physical and social restructuring. It's a complex human and economic balance that countries are going to be navigating for decades to come. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the data.